We know that AI helps us work faster and more efficiently, but what if it could also help us live longer, healthier lives? We want to introduce you to Interconnected, a fascinating new podcast about the tech behind the tech. This week, they dive into the revolution that AI is bringing to medicine. In episode 2, world-renowned cardiologist Dr. Eric Topol and decentralized pioneer Jim Nasser explain how AI is enhancing disease prevention, supercharging personalized care, and giving patients control of their data. Listen to Interconnected today, wherever you get your podcasts.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. September is upon us. Hope everybody is starting to enjoy some fall weather and changing of the seasons. My favorite time of the year, if that comes up in discussion. One of the things that we talk about a lot, obviously, is kind of this intersection of cloud and AI. Obviously, Kubernetes is beginning to gain more and more widespread adoption, along with cloud, but also around AI topics and so forth. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is with this acceleration around, how we're using technology, kind of the pressures around business to make sure that we're getting things successful, what are some of the areas in which companies can look for to become more efficient at what they do, become more effective at getting things into production, determining what's going to work for their business and so forth, and as well looking at how is AI impacting the way that we're developing things, whether it's improving, augmenting what developers can do, maybe providing better test coverage, whatever those things might be. And today we really want to dive into a topic that I don't know that we've spent a lot of time on from a testing perspective. Obviously, we've covered Kubernetes quite a bit, but kind of want to dive into, what does the testing side of our applications, our environments look like, so that we can make sure that, as we roll out more and more applications, whether they're, new rollouts or updates and so forth, we can do that efficiently. And excited today to going to be diving in with the good folks over at TestKube and diving into, how they are, bringing a new approach to looking at testing, as well as, better integrating with our DevOps and our GitOps team. So we're going to get to that right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by TestKube. Testing applications in Kubernetes doesn't have to be complicated. TestKube is your go-to platform for cloud-native continuous testing. With TestKube, you can orchestrate, scale, and automate tests effortlessly right within Kubernetes, catching issues early and deploying with confidence. Try it out today and see why engineering teams trust TestKube to keep their testing simple and scalable. Your tests, your tools, your infrastructure finally together. Check it out at testkube.io/cloudcast. Today's show is sponsored by Doit. Cloud spend is just the surface. What really matters is how it drives performance, reliability, and speed to market. Doit Cloud Intelligence aligns every dollar to the intent of the workloads. Doit is trusted by companies like Fiverr, HackerRank, Current, and Superbet. Doit helps teams go beyond dashboards, surfacing hidden inefficiencies, resolving incidents faster, and aligning cloud operations with business priorities. One platform, unified signals, better outcomes across engineering and finance. Visit doit.com, that's DOIT.com, to unlock intent-aware FinOps at scale. Doit Cloud Intelligence. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, folks, we are going to dig into a topic that I don't know that we've covered a lot of, specifically around the testing aspect of it. Obviously, we've talked about Kubernetes for a long time, but it's we've been hearing from a number of people that as they scale out their environments, whether they're scaling out in the cloud, scaling out cloud native environments, they're looking for more and more ways to be efficient, to make sure that as dollars are tight in some situations, they want to make sure they're doing a good job, that when they're rolling things out, it's just going to work. And so we thought, let's go dig into some areas in which we can figure out a little better how to make the things that you do even pre-production more efficient, more scalable, more accurate. And so very excited today to have Ole Lensmar, who is founder and CTO at TestKube, joining us today. And Ole, great to have you here. Great to have you here in the United States to do this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We've been learning a little bit about TestKube recently, but tell us about your background, because you've got a very rich background around this space, and then what ultimately led you to decide to start TestKube.
Sure. I'll I'll try to be brief. So I started, mid '90s, building APIs, and started with XML and that kind of stuff. And in early 2000s, I started an open source project called SoapUI, which became a very popular API testing tool that was then kind of in people's minds replaced by Postman, but it was very popular in the days for SOAP, of course, and service-oriented architecture and all those kind of things. And we joined SmartBear in 2011, where I continued to work with API testing, but also then took on the Swagger tooling that SmartBear acquired, and was kind of very involved in both the products that were built around that, but also was the chairman of the Open API Initiative for a couple of years. So since the standard itself was donated to the Linux Foundation, and then left SmartBear, and then 4 years ago, one of my colleagues from SmartBear, Dimitri, who was the VP of engineering there, and we kicked off this project, Kube Shop, that eventually evolved into just focusing on TestKube, which was one of our original product ideas. And here we are.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's we always love talking to founders who had sort of lived through the problems that they then try and go and solve. So that's very, very cool background. Let's talk about the origins of TestKube. There's a great post that you wrote that we put a link in the show notes for as to why you started the company. But I'm curious, what were some of the areas that you were seeing people, have frustrations or limitations in the testing space that eventually was either holding them back from getting things into production, or made them feel like I just don't have the confidence that I need to move this into the next phase to get it in production.
Yeah, so I think it was twofold. So one is working at SmartBear, which was still is a testing tool company, or focusing on that. I talked to a lot of QA people, right, and as CI/CD was becoming more and more popular and people were automating and building pipelines, testing was always something like a second-class citizen in that world, right? Yeah. So tests were injected into pipelines. And testers themselves didn't often have a lot of say or power there. If they wanted to rerun specific tests, they had to wait for the next build, or if they wanted to augment those tests in any way, they'd have to delegate that to an ops person or build engineer, etc. So it was kind of testing was being performed, but it was kind of sidelined in that sense. And then CI/CD tools themselves were not really focusing on providing a great experience for testing. So when it comes to centralized reporting or results for all the tests you're running across your pipelines, or how do I reuse tests across pipelines, or how do I make sure that my tests run consistently and that it supports all the testing tools, etc. And things that, definitely some CI/CD vendors have taken steps in that direction, but it's ultimately not their core, target audience, QA. So I think those were the two things that were kind of the nags or the annoyances in the space, that I'd encountered. And then when Kubernetes, started, again, gaining traction, and people started building applications in a cloud native way and adopting things like GitOps, and moving to more asynchronous delivery pipelines, where you kind of split up CI to build your artifacts, and then CD might be running asynchronously by Argo or some other mechanism. That people were also struggling. Okay, how do we inject testing into all of this? And do we now have to write scripts both in GitHub Actions and, stuff within the GitOps tool that we're using? And how do we then consolidate all our results in one place? And how do we, make sure the same test works the right way everywhere? And so it kind of just multiplied from there, I guess. Maybe somewhat of a lengthy background, but I think that's kind of really the problems that we're trying to solve with TestKube.
Yeah, no, and it makes sense. And even if we just think about sort of the history of how we started talking about things, we were talking about DevOps, and then you heard DevSecOps and you heard about, but you never really heard the word or the concept of test kind of re-brought back into that. It was assumed that it was in there somewhere, typically, I guess, on dev, the whole idea of you build it, you run it. But I can kind of see where you're seeing where it sort of, I don't want to say it got forgotten, but it didn't get prioritized as much, or it didn't get emphasized as much.
You're right. There was the whole shift left movement's been going on for a while. So, right. And I think that in many minds, people thought that, okay, so that's testing becomes a dev thing, which to a certain extent, sure, developers should be writing unit tests and creating tests, but there is a post kind of development phase testing when it comes to end-to-end testing or integration testing, but also just non-functional testing. So security, performance, compliance, all that kind of stuff that devs usually don't do. So to your point, that falls more into the area of ops. And I know that there's dev test ops and there's test ops. There's kind of these, but those are more vendor driven, I think, terms than they are, bottom up kind of things that we've seen, practices in the space.
Right. So, so you're seeing, you're seeing an opportunity in which you've lived through this from various previous testing tools. You're seeing Kubernetes come along. It's got a different way of scaling. It sort of aligns to the way that people are building things. Talk to me about the basics of TestKube. So as you're explaining it to people, how is it different from existing testing tools and environments, or where does it run parallel to CI/CD? Kind of frame me up what it does, and then maybe where it would fit in most people's minds.
Yeah. So, definitely. I'd love to do that. So TestKube is all about test orchestration and execution. So what that means is that we take any existing test that you have. So we're not here to compete with Playwright or Postman or K6 or whatever. We take any test that you have that you can Dockerize, and then we make sure that those tests run at scale, leveraging Kubernetes as the kind of orchestration framework.
Okay.
As part of that, we decouple kind of test execution from CI/CD. So instead of the test being run in like GitHub Actions or in Jenkins, tests are being executed in Kubernetes, and those executions are managed by TestKube. You can still trigger those executions from your CI/CD tool, but as I was talking about earlier, we also see the need to trigger tests not just from CI/CD, but for example, based on infrastructure events. So let's say you're updating configuration in infrastructure, or you're redeploying something. You want that to trigger the execution of, an infrastructure test or a performance test or whatever, right? So it's not tightly coupled to a deployment pipeline, more to an event happening in your infrastructure. So that's also a very common way that you can trigger tests with TestKube, and it's also very popular with our customers, where they might even have, you're deploying an application to one cluster and you want that to trigger the tests in another cluster because you want to make sure that there's accessibility from one cluster to another. So there's just the nature of cloud native applications as they become more distributed and kind of broken down into smaller pieces also puts new requirements on how you need to test to make sure that everything works. And that just doesn't work if you're just bluntly doing it from your CI/CD pipeline. So backing up, it's about running any test that you have inside Kubernetes and leveraging Kubernetes constructs to scale your tests. So if you're, scaling your load tests or your functional tests. And then at the end of that, TestKube aggregates all the results and all the artifacts and all the logs that you want into one place, where then devs and QA and can go in and troubleshoot tests, where they have one dashboard to kind of analyze the results, do reporting, do all the troubleshooting, regardless of where that test ran, where in your infrastructure it ran, what kind of test it was, and how it was triggered. So it's really that central control plane, or whatever you want to call it, for all your test orchestration activities.
I gotcha. That makes sense. Do you see it, primarily used in environments where where the application is going to be deployed is Kubernetes, or does it have, can it just sort of use the scalability of Kubernetes to help, for, if I'm just doing, regular EC2 types of deployments that don't take advantage? Is it more geared towards containers in Kubernetes, or does it have some flexibility as to what the end result is?
That's a great question. So Kubernetes is the runtime for TestKube, but to your point, your application under test doesn't have to be under Kubernetes. And we have several customers who are, like you're saying, running EC2 or, maybe even on VMs still, right? Who have not made that transition. Most companies today have some Kubernetes presence in their infrastructure. But even if they don't, we do actually have customers who've installed Kubernetes just to be able to run TestKube. But so as long as there's network connectivity from that cluster to the application under test, you'll be able to run any test once again and leverage then the scalability, et cetera, that you have within Kubernetes to scale out your tests.
Gotcha. And who do you find, you talked a little bit about like test ops and, should devs be building unit tests? Like, are you seeing TestKube typically used as sort of an expansion of the dev team? Is it, I guess the question I'm trying to understand a little better is, do we still see the majority of companies or kind of organizations have dedicated test teams, or is this typically an expansion of either dev or ops? Like who's using the tool? Where do they find it most effective? Where do you find it gives the most value?
Another great question. So we see all of that, I guess. I think that we mostly land with ops people. So people who are tasked with scaling up tests and running tests in their infrastructure. And they kind of look at, okay, how do I run this massive K6 test on Kubernetes? Or how do I more efficiently run whatever tests we have, right, in Kubernetes? And so that's how they find us. And then from there, they see that, oh, this was actually really easy. I can run any test I want I can integrate with, the CI/CD tools that I have. And many of our customers have multiple CI/CD tools, right? So they have both like a legacy Jenkins installation, they have GitLab, and they have Argo CD. And this gives them like one consistent way of running tests, regardless of how you want to trigger them. But it's an ops problem initially. And then they usually go to the QA team and say, hey, look what we have here. This will really help you. And or this could really help you kind of have a more centralized view of how, or approach to how we run tests and how you work with tests. And then the QA team usually often depends on, once again, if there is a QA team or if it's not just, but if testing is done by dev. QA teams will sometimes have already a test management tool in place. So they're going to look at how does that integrate. They might have invested in cloud execution testing providers, which is an opportunity for us because leveraging your own infrastructure is usually more efficient. So then the next step becomes kind of getting that into the QA team and making sure that they're also comfortable with that. So I think that's one way we land. The other one is maybe at a higher level, we've seen companies just, we're shifting to Kubernetes. How are we going to do testing efficiently? So that's more of a C-level strategic decision than we're going to cloud native, and then they look for cloud native testing tools or testing approaches, and that's how they find us. So it's a little bit of everything. But I do think that initially, since we are so closely tied to Kubernetes and we use CRDs for our tests and we talk a lot about GitOps and those things, it's very often that we start with the ops people are the ones who find us.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I've seen that so often. It's, if you were already doing things sort of in that Kubernetes space, you understood containers, you understood the YAML of it. It was a simple, sort of next step. Whereas maybe some of the other groups, there's a learning curve. What are some of the, as it's going into place, as you've got, let's just take the use case in which people are doing things with Kubernetes or with containers. Like, what are some of the best practices you're seeing that, doing things with TestKube is sort of accelerating stuff from where they were before? Like, what are some of the, best practices you're seeing or the benefits that they're seeing that being aligned to the way everybody else is doing things is helping them?
There's a lot of things. I think specifically in Kubernetes, the possibility to create ephemeral environments for testing is something that's pretty easy. I mean, it's not trivial, but it's easy. It's easier than it is without Kubernetes in many cases. So that's definitely a best practice we see a lot, where people provision an ephemeral like vCluster, or they're using some other tool as part of their build pipelines. And then they use TestKube to kind of run any tests they might need in those ephemeral environments. So that's definitely a best practice, where you can do more elaborate testing earlier on, right? So you don't have to wait with deploying an application into a staging environment before you do more thorough end-to-end testing. I think that's one best practice. Another, maybe on the flip side of that, is maybe not automating too many tests as part of your build processes, but letting some tests wait until applications or components are deployed into your staging infrastructure, just because you don't want, tests can take a lot of time.
Sure.
And you have, often if your applications are built of a lot of different components, it's only in that infrastructure that they actually come together, right? So even in an ephemeral environment, you might be testing a slice of your application, right? You have 10 microservices stood up, but not all 50 of them. Right. So what we see is people kind of using both, like I said, ephemeral and running end-to-end tests as part of maybe CI, but also then maybe running more elaborate end-to-end tests on a schedule every 4 hours, every 8 hours, whatever, in a staging environment as a kind of a safety net to make sure that's all working. And then beyond that, we see people using progressive delivery, like Argo rollouts, like doing Canary or blue-green deployments. And there you can also tie testing into that as a way to validate as you roll out that maybe performance doesn't degrade, right? Or other maybe non-functional aspects of your application don't get compromised. Another thing that TestKube makes it really easy to run different types of tests at the same time. So if you, let's say you want to run a functional test at the same time that as you're running a load test, or a security test at the same time you're running a load test, just to make sure that as you put load on your system, that doesn't compromise the functionality or the security or whatever else. Right. So that's also a best practice that we really see TestKube actually enabling to do more complex test orchestration to really make sure that, that the real life scenarios that your applications will be put under in when they're, out to end users are actually also tested before you actually deploy in production.
Yeah, no, and that makes a ton of sense. It's, just the idea, like you said, that, that you can leverage the native pieces of Kubernetes. So like you said, whether you want to do blue, green or canary, or you say, I just want to test this small part of something, it just, those native primitives and those native building blocks are there. So the ability to align, partial capabilities, or, well, we just want to do this. Kubernetes does a pretty good job of giving you kind of those similar building blocks to go validate and things.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe also to best practice just around kind of the fact that Kubernetes makes it relatively easy to scale out things, right? Sure. So suddenly, instead of running your Playwright, Cypress, Selenium tests sequentially against different browser engines, you can now parallelize. And that's something we've really put a lot of effort into TestKube to make that easy. That could make a huge difference, maybe not from a resource consumption perspective, but from a time perspective, right? Instead of now having to wait 3 minutes, you only have to wait 30 seconds for your test to pass. And that can make a big difference, of course. Yeah.
And I think that highlights something that may not always be obvious to people when they start doing things with cloud native and Kubernetes, is that the way that you scale may be different than what you expected before. And just sort of having sort of that native capability, that native scalability, and it just saves you a lot of the mental translation you have to do from, like, I used to do it this way to now to how does this work? And if your applications take off, if the scale of it takes off, you just kind of want to be able to go, just align to what that is. What do you see? Are you seeing things change at all in the test community or in the test environments in terms of how they're measuring themselves, or how they look at success, or with sort of the newer way that we're building applications? Have you seen, if people are saying, like, should I make an investment in test? What's it going to do for either the success of applications or improve the business? Like, are you seeing that discussion change, or the metrics around that change at all?
No, I think what we're seeing is, especially now with also AI driving, is that a continuous, or maybe recognition of testing is important. I guess, it's one of the things everyone says, but maybe not everyone lives up to. I think from a purely tactical approach, we're seeing the concept of quality gates being something that many teams embrace more today. So being able to define kind of, when is my application or my component ready to be deployed, and then having some kind of promotion of your releases across environments using tools like Cargo and others, or Tekton. Once again, an asynchronous approach. So that's kind of it's a little bit of a different way of thinking around quality, and which is, I always found it interesting when people say, well, if 90% of our tests pass, then we're good to go. I'm like, shouldn't every test pass? But they're like, no, and because we know there's flaky tests, there's always going to be some tests that fail.
Right.
And you could say, of this batch of tests, all of them have to pass. But of this test, we know there's some flakiness because they depend on network or whatever. So we have a little bit more lax view of quality in that. So I think that's just interesting when you kind of reality kicks in, right? Because on our side, or from academically, you'd say, well, all tests have to pass because, what if you release a bug? But you just have to be a little bit pragmatic, say it's unlikely, especially with cloud native and, the complexity of distributed applications and infrastructure. There's likely, there are hiccups, and we'll just have to adapt to that also in our concept of quality.
Sure. One of the things I hear in talking to developers a lot is whether they like the new AI tools, the coding assistants, or whether they embrace them or not. The idea of like, oh, well, but this thing could write tests for me. It could write unit tests or it could write tests for me. It seems to be very appealing because that may not be their most exciting part of their job or the part they want to do the most. Are you seeing more and more tests that you can identify as being written by AI? Is there any level of quality of that, or are you being asked by people to flag? So for example, like in the writing side of the world, AI tends to have this characteristic that it throws M dashes and things, and so when people see stuff that they're like, that looks a little funny. Are you seeing that any characteristics, in the AI test writing thing, in which either you're seeing more test coverage than you saw before, but the quality's not as good, or anything in that space that is starting to raise some eyebrows for you?
That's a super interesting question. I am guessing would apply just to any code generated. Sure. Can you how did you detect that? I'm sure there are some traits of AI generated code that someone could identify. I haven't seen any of that traits like that. We definitely see like a concern, maybe is the wrong word, but a discussion on how this generated, we're generating more code. How do we make sure it's tested? And we're generating tests. And how do we make sure those tests are actually valid is one point, right? It's like, asking developers to write tests for their own code. There's a bias there, right? Sure. So often you want someone else to write the tests for the code. But it's also on the flip side, then how do you run all those tests efficiently? If you're suddenly now asking AI to generate tests for you, and there's some review process, and I'm sure I'm a firm believer in that AI can really help you be more productive sounds a little bit generic, but kind of help you. Maybe let's say you're saying, testing, it's a hassle to get started, but you can use AI tools to say, look at these requirements in my requirement tool, or just based on this requirement, could you create a simple playwright's test skeleton? And it'll do that. And then someone has to take the next steps. But it's usually that first step that's the big hurdle. And then when you're running, that is, I think, a huge enabler for more testing. So I'm all for it. Yep. I think maybe then we're going into more than how do you run all those tests efficiently, and how do you make sure you have feedback loops in place. So it'll be super interesting, but it's definitely something that we hear is kind of, and it's an opportunity for us since we're saying we're great at running tests at scale. So that's what we're here for. You're creating more tests. You need to run more tests. We're here to do that with Kubernetes and help you make sure that works out. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of chicken and egg of, if you believe the idea that, the more tests that you're able to write, like you said, if you're able to cover more of the code, you're able to pass more of it, that should result in better quality. It should result in, less outages, less security. But the flip side of that becomes like, well, okay, if we start doing that more efficiently, do we have the right tools in place? Do we have the right infrastructure in place? And it feels like, to a certain extent, you guys are positioned really well for, that next way that people are writing code and the byproduct of that. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. Just latching onto the thing there, I think also to your point is that AIs are usually great at or good at like very local context, but the bigger picture is usually not something they have, right? So if they add something or change something in an API, it'll be hard for them to know that this could break something farther out. So having that high level integration tests, end-to-end tests in place, and infrastructure testing is also, we see becomes much more important, just to catch those ripple effects that a change might, introduced by an unassuming AI might lead to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I want to be conscious of your time because I know not only are we doing this in the middle of the day, you've got a business to run, but you are here visiting the States. You're usually outside the States, so you're a busy man. Last question real quick. What's the best way if people want to get started? Do you typically find that if they want to get started with TestKube, do they reach out to your team? Are you finding that they just sort of self-serve themselves through trials and open source? What's the best way that you find for people to not only get started, but to be successful with TestKube and this new way of expanding their testing?
Well, so there's an open source version that you can get started with. So that's for different people like to start in different ways. So definitely a big fan of that. And I mean, as I alluded to my background, I've always been a big proponent of open source as a way to engage with users, etc. And so that's one way. The other is, to your point, getting started with the trial. I do, like you said, Kubernetes is complex, so we do see a much higher level of like initial success is when people actually reach out to us and let us, just to kind of make sure that they're understanding how TestKube architecturally fits into their infrastructure and what they're trying to do. It doesn't have to be a 60-minute sales demo, right? It could be just like a sales engineer, solution architect saying, okay, just tell me a little bit, are you running OpenShift or are you running on Google Cloud? Okay, these are the things you need to be aware of when it comes to authentication or, ingresses or what have not, just to make sure that you're not, frustrated and by an initial kind of hiccup. But that's all on the website, and you can download a trial and get a license and off you go. And there are definitely ways, if you don't, you'd rather explore it on yourself. But as a side note, we do, it's usually good to just talk to someone just to make sure it's
Absolutely. Well, good. Well, Ole, thank you so much for the time today. Learned a lot. Hopefully the audience is, if they're in this environment, they're thinking about, how do we better utilize our resources? How do we make our applications better? That you guys are right there sort of front of mind. So with that, folks, I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank Ole for his time today. I want to thank the folks from TestKube for being a good partner here recently. With that, I'll wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.